So this is Chapter 6, Survey Research, Part 1, Constructing a Survey. So this is really common type of work that people do. You'll probably do this at some point in connection with any job you have almost. So this is how to do it well. So we will start with a little example of a survey experiment. And this might seem contradictory because usually we think of surveys for descriptive research, but there are ways of doing experiments, and here is one example. So the question that interested the researcher was, how do emotional responses to threatening situations impact risk assessment? And so let's look at what this means. So this study was done shortly after the 9/11 attacks, and a large sample of people, Americans aged 13 to 88, were part of the sample. So they actually had an independent variable and dependent variable. Their independent variable was emotional evocation, anger versus fear. And what this means is they primed their participants to experience the 9/11 attacks, either generating feelings of anger by, as part of the survey, asking people what made them angry about the attacks, and showing them photos and listening to audio tapes that would prime to make them feel angry. Or in condition 2, some of the surveys had questions designed to prime fear, meaning that the people were asked what made them fearful about the attacks, and they were shown photos and audio to prime fear. So each participant had mostly the same questions, but they had this one distinction, whether they were primed for anger or fear. And as the dependent variable, the researchers measured risk assessment. In other words, they asked survey questions about how great each participant felt the risk was for future attacks on the United States. And the main finding that's relevant is that participants who were primed to feel anger perceived less risk than those who had been primed to feel fear. So that's kind of interesting, suggesting that whatever emotion is evoked about a traumatic event can actually impact how dangerous or how threatened you are in the future. So kind of an interesting study, and one example of the way experimental surveys can be used to generate data. So the key topics covered in your readings, and that I'll touch on some of these in this lecture, include what is survey research, what's the history of survey research, and the purpose of survey research. How are survey responses dependent on psychological processes, and how do good survey questions take into account the psychological processes? And you can see here the readings associated with this content. So what is survey research? So the two main characteristics are these. First, the variables are measured through self-report measures, questionnaires, or interviews. And if you're having an independent variable and dependent variable, both of them are measured through these self-report measures, and that's why it's survey research. And sampling is of critical importance because the survey respondents must represent the population well. There's not any other way to randomize, and so we really have to be careful who we use when we're conducting research that is straightforward survey research. So other than those, survey research can be widely variable. They can be long surveys or short surveys, qualitative, meaning the answers are generally in words, or quantitative analysis. They can have purposes that are descriptive, quasi-experimental, non-experimental, or experimental. So they can really vary. We're probably most familiar with the descriptive kind that are done all the time. So the purposes of research then, generally descriptive. We are very familiar with these. They might describe local or national conditions like the census survey or similar economic surveys. Maybe they predict, they want to learn more about like interest in something or likely participation in some new endeavor, so to predict what kind of response they would get. Or to explore, to learn about people's experiences in the face of important events, understand attitudes or opinions, as in political polls or market surveys. To evaluate, gauge success of events, And of course, we've not even touched on in this list the types of research that are experimental in nature or quasi-experimental. So really, all of these are descriptive. Data for surveys are produced something like this. Usually we'll have a frequency chart. And so in this case, we're looking at prevalence, which is the percent of people that develop a disorder in their lifetime. You can see that we have usually a nice title for the survey. This is a typical APA structure for a survey. These lines are part of that APA structure. The bold is part of the structure. The absence of vertical lines is part of the APA structure. And how things are defined in a notes section at the bottom is part of that structure. And you would read this kind of table is just describing percentage male, percent female. So data might be presented this way or in a graph. So constructing surveys takes a little bit more than we sometimes think. So we look at this cognitive model of survey responses to understand where problems can occur, and they can occur at many different points. So we'll talk about these in the next slides, but think about what happens when someone responds to even just one survey question. First off, they have to interpret the question. Then they have to kind of tap their brain and figure out what to recall. Then they have to judge their past experience, like usually an estimate of something they're remembering. They have to then align their responses to the question structure and then edit their responses, decide whether or not to tell the truth. So here is an example of a deceptively difficult question. How many alcoholic drinks do you consume in a typical day? And the answer response options are a lot more than average, somewhat more than average, average, somewhat fewer than average, and a lot fewer than average. And you might be thinking this looks like a perfectly reasonable question, but let's look now at what a respondent has to do in order to answer this question. So first off, they have to interpret the question. So what is a typical day? And what is an alcoholic drink? You know, there's like one of those light kind of hard seltzer type drinks, right? Is that a drink? What about like a 2-shot martini? Is that just one drink? And then, of course, what do we mean by a typical day? A weekday, a weekend, you know, summer, winter? So all of those are part of interpretation. Next, the individual has to pull up something from memory. So what experiences should the individual retrieve? You know, and we ask again those same questions about timing. How far back should they go? You know, is it this year or last year since the baby was born? During exam week? You know, what exactly are we pulling up? And then they have to judge. They have to make a decision. How typical is this? You know, is that a typical day? And make a mental calculation about how much they drank on that day. Then they have to align their judgment with the response options. But what do we mean by average? And whose average are we talking about? Like the average for a college student? The average for like your family or your social group? The average in the Navajo Nation? Like what are we comparing it to? So there's problems with the response options. And then finally, you know, maybe this person consumes more alcohol than they want to admit. So even if they pull up everything else, all the right information, and align it with these choices, they still have to decide whether to be honest or to, you know, tone it down a little. So you can see really what seems like a really easy question can have all kinds of problems along the way. So constructing a survey is easy. Constructing a good survey is really challenging. And so just a few examples of things that can lead to misleading and biased results. Question wording, sequencing of items, and response options are just a few. Let's look at these on the next slide. So question wording effects. Some people might have leading questions. questions that point responses in a particular direction. So here's the first bullet point is a problematic question. How delicious is the food served at Dene College? And you can see how it leads the respondent to assume that there's some sort of deliciousness involved. So it's a leading question, leading in a particular direction, as opposed to the fixed answer, rate the overall taste of the food served at Dene College, which allows the respondent latitude and it doesn't lead them in one direction. Another problem is loaded questions, questions that require qualifying information. So let's look at the first bullet point, the problematic example. On what road do you most often drive over the speed limit? Well, it's a problem because it assumes that people do in fact drive over the speed limit, and we haven't qualified this. We haven't had a question yet that indicates whether they do or don't drive over the speed limit. And so a fixed response would be to turn this into two questions. Question A, do you sometimes drive over the speed limit? And then if yes, on what road do you most often drive over the speed limit? So another kind of challenge. And sometimes we run into double-barreled questions, which means two questions compressed into a single item. It makes it very hard for respondents to know what to do. So for example, imagine that I asked a survey question, how would you rate the lectures and supplementary videos in our class? So think about you having to answer. Maybe you really liked the lectures and didn't like the supplementary videos, or maybe you liked the supplementary videos and not the lectures. How are you going to answer this question? So what's better to do is to divide it into two questions. How would you rate the lectures in our course? And how would you rate the supplementary videos in our course? Context effects are another thing that can emerge. And context is like the background in which a question occurs. And so we talked about order effects earlier with certain kinds of stimulus in experimental research, and now we're talking about the order effect for the presentation of items on a survey. And so that order or sequence in which questions are asked can impact responses. So this is a sequence, a study by Schwartz and Strack, 1990, this example from your book. And these two questions, and first asked in this order. In general, how satisfied are you with your life? And number two, how frequently do you go out on dates? And the participants are single college students living in the dorms. And that's an insecure time for college students. So now we first ask them how satisfied are they, and they go, yeah, I'm doing pretty well. And then we ask them, how often do you go out on dates? And they're like, oh, once in a while. So seems like a reasonable sequence. Now consider this sequence. First we ask them, how frequently do you go out on dates? And thinking back, they think, oh boy, it's been several weeks now. Oh, I'm really not doing very well with, potential dating partners. And then question two, in general, how satisfied are you with your life? And you might be able to see how this sequence would be very important. How in the first example, when they're asked about satisfaction first, they might get higher responses than when they first ask about dates and then about satisfaction. So these are things that you seriously have to consider when you're developing surveys. So a few things to think about. And then we also have response option effects. So response options are the scaling that you're using to generate your answers. So the available response options can bias people's interpretation of a question. So consider this question, another example from your book. How often are you really irritated? First, let's consider that you put down this response set. More than once a month, once every few months, a few times per year. So, and now think response set 2, more than once a day, about once a day, 2 to 3 times a week, about once a week. I think you can see how these different response sets would lead to different interpretations of this phrase, really irritated. In response set 1, where the response options are very infrequent, they would think of really irritated as maybe flying off the handle in a potentially violent way. As opposed to if they had a response set 2, where these are happening pretty regularly, they might think of really irritated as being nothing more than, the car in front of you is driving too slow. So that's what we mean by response option effects in parts. That's one example. And so this exemplifies what I just said. But you can see how the response options here impact the interpretation of the question. Considering, how satisfied are you with your workplace? And let's look at response set 1, completely satisfied, very satisfied, somewhat satisfied, and not satisfied. So if this looks a little unbalanced to you, it is a little unbalanced. You can see that someone who's not satisfied really has only just this one option. And so it's kind of a skewed response set toward the positive satisfaction side. So, creating survey questions. So there are a couple of types of items you can use, and one type is open-ended items. And open-ended items are just questions that allow participants to answer in any way they choose. So it means that participants can offer a written response, whatever they choose to write. So examples: what is the biggest reason you decided to pursue higher education? Or, please describe your experience at the most difficult part of your Canal d'A ceremony. Or a question that often comes at the end of a survey: what else would you like to add? This just gives people a chance to either describe something in their own words or to say something that they just couldn't get out during the survey itself. And the advantages of these kinds of questions: they are so easy to write. And they also allow the researcher to find out in the respondent's own words what a particular experience was. And this is good, especially if it's a new kind of experience, like questions related to sort of technological or AI advances, things like that. Open-ended questions are good because they allow us to learn firsthand from respondents. However, they require more time from participants, so sometimes people just leave these blank. And especially, they require more time and effort to analyze. Typically, open-ended questions are analyzed through a transcription. So the responses are all written down or pulled into a single data set, and then they are coded. And usually what a person would be doing is either using some software or just going through it manually and identifying like common themes that come up in people's responses and trying to make sense of the answers in some sort of large-scale way. And very often you don't want to have just one person doing the coding because they might infuse their own bias into that interpretation. So often you need 2 or even more people doing this coding, and this gets us to the possibility of being tangled in inter-rater reliability and things like that. So they're really time-consuming at the analysis end. They're easy at the front end, hard at the later end. So very often we end up with closed-ended items, and these are just items that have response options. A person cannot respond freely. So here are some examples. Age, instead of you writing your number of years, you have these categories: under 20, 20 to 34, 35 to 49, 50 to 65, over 65. Or, how frequently do you experience difficulty falling asleep? And instead of letting a person just write their answer, we have response options: just about every day, about every 2 to 3 days, about once per week, etc. Or, write your agreement with this statement: I like cooking. Answer options: degree, disagree, and agree. Could be just that straightforward. Excuse me. The advantages are they're useful when the researcher has a broad sense of an area of interest. So if the researcher already has some ideas about what kind of responses to expect. They're quantifiable, so analysis is so easy. One person can do the analysis. The numbers are what the numbers are. And participants like them. They're easy for participants to answer. The drawback is they're harder to write, these questions, because there's lots of potential for misinterpretation and bias, like we looked at before, and poor questions can lead to careless or biased responses. So many closed-ended items are rating scales, and rating scales just allow readers to indicate the intensity of an experience. So very often we might have a 5-point scale, something like this: never, rarely, sometimes, often, and always. Or, excuse me, a 7-point scale, like very much, like somewhat, like slightly, neither like nor dislike slightly, dislike somewhat, dislike very much. Or a bipolar response scale, yes or no, followed by branching depending on a response. So you might have noticed here on the 7-point scale we have a lot of words, but typically these words would be converted to numbers for the sake of analysis. So we might, like very much might be 1, like somewhat might be 2, like slightly might be 3, and so forth. And that allows easier analysis. We can run into problems with response options that are too specific. A person might not be able to fit themselves right in. And we can solve this problem using things like slider scales, where there would be a little bar along this extremely unfriendly to extremely friendly, and a person could just drag that bar to a point that seemed about right for their own level of intensity. Or, of course, using these numbers as I just indicated. Likert scales, this is probably something that you've heard before, and probably you have described rating scales like those on the previous slide as Likert scales. And so just to be clear, Likert scales actually involve presenting people with several statements about a topic, like 3 statements to determine how extroverted you are. And then some of those statements would be worded positively and others negatively, but we would reverse code the negative items. And we might be asking them to rate their agreement on, for example, a 5-point scale. And so we've already looked at those scales. So they look just like rating scales, but the difference is how we code them. So we would reverse code the reversed items and then calculate a single score on the construct of interest. And so Likert scaled items allow us to do things like factor analysis or develop the types of inventories that many of you might be using for your dependent measures. So Likert scale refers to the entire set of items. So let's just refer to the kind of scales using these 5-point rating scales or whatever it is as this is a rating scale, and if we put several of these together, we have a Likert scale. So to write effective items, we can use this BRUSO acronym, which isn't the easiest to think of, but that's the one we have. So B stands for brief. You want your items to be as short as possible. The more words you have, the harder it is for people to answer, and the more likely it is that you're going to get something messy in your statement or question. The R is for relevant. Make sure you don't ask extra questions. Like, only ask the questions that you need to know that are relevant to your topic. The U is for unambiguous. Only write questions for which there is only one possible interpretation. We'll look at some examples of these on the next slides, by the way. S is for specific. Write questions that are specific to just one topic, no double-barreled items. And objective. No leading questions that reveal researchers' bias or perspective. So here is just some example items from your textbook. Excuse me, my voice. So a poor item is this: are you now or have you ever been the possessor of a firearm? Can you see all the extra words in here? And as opposed to the simple, more effective question, have you ever owned a gun? So this one's much easier to answer. And this one almost seems accusatory. So R for relevant, what is your sexual orientation? Is it necessary for your survey to know this? Do you have a reason to hypothesize that sexual orientation would make a difference in terms of people's responses? Maybe you do, and in that case you should include it. But you shouldn't just include it as a general demographic type question. U for unambiguous. A poor question example is, are you a gun person? So what does that mean exactly, right? So better to just be clear and say what you mean instead of leaving this phrase gun person up to interpretation. Just ask, do you currently own a gun? S for specific. How much have you read about the new gun control measure and sales tax? Look at this messy double-barreled question. We have now we have a pretty ambiguous question too, because how do we answer this? But we have two things that they might have read about. And so we want to break these into two items. And the first one might be, how much have you read about the new sales tax? And objective, in this first example under the column poor, we have, how much do you support the new gun control measure? So you can see how this is kind of leading. We're, leading in the direction of support for this measure. And we want to just say a more neutral question, what is your view of the new gun control measure? So let's take a look at some of these and see if we can identify what the problem might be. Excuse me. To what extent do you agree that the trial outcome was unfair? And we can see that now we are kind of leading our participants toward unfairness, and I would say that this is a problem with objectivity. And we might better phrase the question, rate the fairness of the trial outcome. Number 2, how tech savvy are you? So what might we be running into problems here in terms of the BRUSO framework? And I would say it's the U issue. We need to write questions that are unambiguous, but tech savvy is a phrase that means different things to different people. So it would be better to say something like, rate your comfort level learning new phone applications. That might be a better way if that was what you meant yourself when you were saying tech savvy. Here's some more examples. How much do you like to eat fruits and vegetables with your meals? So we have a couple problems here. I think it's pretty messy, actually. Probably the worst relates to S specificity. It's a double-barreled question. What about a person? How would a person answer who likes fruits but not vegetables? But we can see the other problem is that this question assumes that the person sometimes has fruits and vegetables with wheels, but we don't know that this is the case. And so we probably need to break this into two questions in order that we aren't having an assumption of information that isn't present. So better to use separate branches, one's for fruits, one's for vegetables, and we better first determine whether or not individuals have these things with their meals before asking how much they like these things. So writing good response sets is another part of what we're doing. So categorical variables are variables, as you know from earlier, where we just have answers that are different categories, like favorite color or marital status. But we do want to take some care with the categories. So first off, we want to make sure that they're mutually exclusive. So you can think of a bad example as being age categories that are under 18, 18 to 25, 25 to 35, 35 to 45, etc. These options are not mutually exclusive because 25 and 35 are listed in more than one category, for example. 18 is not listed in more than one category, but that's the kind of problem we're running into. A person who's 25 or 35 would not know which category to pick. How about this example? Type of pet owned: dog, cat, beagle, bird, fish. These options also are not mutually exclusive because the category dog contains beagle. So a person who owns a beagle would not know whether to check dog or whether to check beagle. So mutually exclusive is the first requirement. Secondly, it must be exhaustive. Every option should be included. So let's think if you put a question like this: marital status, single, married, divorced, widowed. This is not exhaustive because it doesn't include categories like cohabiting, which many enduring lifelong relationships now don't take that step of getting married, but they cohabit, and they certainly wouldn't consider themselves single, nor married, nor divorced, nor widowed. So you see how that creates a problem, not having an exhaustive list. Another example: religion, Christian, Buddhist, Muslim, Hindu. Again, this is not exhausted because there are so many religions that haven't been included. An easy solution to some of these is to just add the option other, and that can resolve the problem of exhaustiveness. So writing good response sets, we come to rated variables. And as we know, rated variables are response sets that ask people to choose words or a number corresponding with the intensity of their experience or agreements. So what are the requirements for rating scales? So first off, they have to be balanced. The neutral state must be in the center of the options. So we don't want to have a set like this: unlikely, somewhat likely, likely, very likely, and extremely likely, because there's only one option on the not likely end and 4 options on the likely end. So better to say very unlikely, somewhat unlikely, neutral, somewhat likely, very likely. And note that we do not have to have that neutral option. That neutral option is a nice cop-out for people who don't want to take the time to think about where they stand. And I tend to prefer some kind of forced choice. It could be a scale just like this, but it doesn't include the neutral option. And so it's what's in the second bullet point here is the way I tend to go myself. And the reason I like it is because it kind of pushes people. Most of the time people lean one way or the other, and even if it's just very slight, it's helpful information for the researcher to know what that leaning is. I wrote here, forced choice is more difficult for respondents but yields richer information for the researcher because respondents cannot just rest on the neutral option. And of course, forced choice can also be simple yes/no questions. So you'll also want to include validation checks on your survey. So we know that survey respondents can become tired or bored with the survey, and then they might start just putting forward careless or inattentive responses. To check for this, we include certain kinds of questions called validation checks. So for example, we might have reverse questions, asking similar questions but reversing the direction of it, like this. We might consider both the statement, quote, I consider myself to be very well liked, and the statement, other people usually do not like me. And we look at their agreement on both. And a person who agrees strongly or tends to agree with both statements is a potential red flag. And it's really easy when you get the data to just do checks for these. If they answer the same on these, it's just a flag. And then we can take a look. The questions aren't exactly reverse. Sometimes you can put exactly reverse items like, I consider myself to be very well liked. And then later on a question that says, I consider myself to be not well liked, or something like that. Here we have it's a little more indirect, and so in this case, even if a person agreed with them both, it's potentially plausible that it's rational. So this would just be a red flag for us to look more closely at this person's responses in general. We can also have direct requests, like including direct statements like, Mark strongly agree for this question. And this just helps us to identify any waning of attention that may have occurred, and it doesn't mean we get that person in trouble, especially if we've created a long survey, which isn't the wisest thing to do. It just means that at least we've flagged it. We're looking closely at this, and if this person's attention has lapsed too much, we might have to toss out their responses. So formatting the survey, putting it together, we'll talk a little bit more about the medium in which you format your survey, but just some general tips for the starting and ending. So first off, you're going to need some sort of an introduction, and your introduction would serve two purposes: to encourage participants by explaining the purpose of the survey, and often to obtain informed consent. And so you would be telling respondents about the topics, the time requirement, the respondent's option to withdraw, confidentiality measures, source of information, additional information, or to report problems, and all of those things that we learned about way back in week 3. And then you might have some instructions along the way, especially important if you have any unusual prompts or scales that people might not have seen before, even if it's just a sliding scale. So you might state, for a slider scale, use your mouse to drag the bar to the location approximating your agreement. And if it's really complicated, maybe you'd have a little video, a little GIF coming up there to show them how to do it. If you have a question that allows multiple responses, you should indicate check all that apply. And usually those would have square checkboxes instead of round orbit boxes. Another example, if you have a question that may require respondents to rely on recall of a past event, you might instruct them to, quote, answer the following questions as you felt at the time of the event. So telling them not how you feel now, but how you were feeling then, to the best of your recollection. So the order of the questions is next. What question should you put first? And it's recommended that you prioritize. The most important items for your survey should be at their start, when respondents are freshest. So demographic items like about their age and sex and so forth, these often are put at the start of a survey, but really they're best left toward the end. Age, gender, education, they're easy to answer. And done at the end, a person isn't going to have to tax themselves too much to provide these answers. Group similar items together. So if you group items around a similar topic in close proximity, it'll make it easier to, for people to develop associations with the ideas they're being asked about, and it might lead to more accurate results. Finally, you'll want to end your survey in some way, and it's good to have a few things included. So appreciation, always end your survey by thanking respondents for their participation. Additional information, if there's anything more you'd like your participants to know, that would be at the end of your survey, like the equivalent of debriefing after an in-person study. So maybe clarifying anything that you couldn't tell them up front, or explaining some things that might have been confusing while the participants were in the survey. And it's a good idea to have your contacts' names. So for more information or to report concerns about the study, please contact. You might have your name and email address, or your supervisor's name and email address. And so it's a good idea that they can get some contact info right at the end of your survey. So the next lecture will be on conducting the survey, and we'll have some good practical details.